everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith featuring Claire Willis and Marnie Crawford for their books Opening to Grief. My name is Bree and I am the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if this is your first time with us, welcome. We're very happy to have you join our community this evening. And we appreciate your support of the authors and independent bookstores through your purchases and attendance. The chat and question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. Remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so that you can talk to other attendees. And please drop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. The chat can move very quickly, so if you ask questions in the chat, they may get lost. Please also note that the Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. We will be recording tonight's event for posting on YouTube later, but we will stop recording before the Q&A for the sake of privacy. So that's all the business stuff. Now for the introductions. Marnie Crawford Samuelson is a documentary photographer, multimedia producer, and storyteller. Her photographs have appeared in national magazines and in 2 books, Lasting Words with Claire Willis, and The Wild Braid with poet Stanley Kuntz and Janine Lentil. She has co-directed several short documentary films. Claire Willis is a clinical social worker and lay Buddhist chaplain with a focus on people living with cancer and bereavement groups. She co-founded Facing Cancer Together, a nonprofit located in Brighton, and maintains a small private practice in Brookline. Her first book was Lasting Words, A Guide to Finding Meaning Towards the Close of Life. And with that, please help me welcome Marnie and Claire.
Thank you all so much for coming. We're so glad you're here to help us launch this book, which, as many of you have lived through it, know it's been more 4 years in the making. We'd like to thank Brookline Booksmith for hosting this launch, and we also would like to urge you to buy your books through them and review them on Amazon. Of course, we know that many of you are here to celebrate with Marnie and me, but there's others who have joined us, and we'd like to introduce ourselves for those of you that don't know us. I'm Claire, and I'm the co-author with Marnie Crawford Samuelson. And Marnie and I have known each other a long time because we went to camp together when we were little.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. And I'll just say in advance that I have no experience presenting on Zoom or anywhere else. I'm usually behind my camera or plunking away at my laptop, far from the spotlight. And I'll also mention the likelihood that I may be clearing my throat or having a coughing jag, which is my little burden. And if that happens, Claire is ready to jump in and cover for me. We've shaped Opening to Grief around Claire's decades-long work leading groups for people with cancer and their caregivers. She's worked for years as a bereavement counselor and as a lay chaplain. Our writing's been inspired by questions that so many people ask in the hours and weeks after a heartbreaking loss. How do I get through this one day? How long will grief last? And in this first year especially, how do I survive the holidays? As co-author, I've tried to shape the text and find a voice that's inviting and open. Your experiences in grief are uniquely yours, and only you know what's happened and what feels right for you. And so Opening to Grief is definitely not an advice book. We want to say that neither of us are experts on grief, but we've tried to share ideas and practices that have supported others who've also experienced profound losses. Our hope is for Opening to Grief to be a companion, a kind companion for these days.
It's been painful for me as a clinician sometimes to see the ways that shame has mixed and swirled around and through grief, which has caused even more suffering to those who are already in immense pain and confusion. In my bereavement groups, it's not unusual to hear someone say, I haven't told anybody else this, and I would only share it here because I know you will understand. One person has told the group that she wears her husband's shirts to bed because she likes to have the scent of him nearby. Another close friend of mine who told me she'd put her 14-year-old pet companion down, told me that she's sleeping with her pet's favorite toy. Both are keeping these important stories undercover as secrets because they fear people will laugh or judge them. I think that finally, with COVID, we are beginning to share our stories of grief and loss so that we can really begin to more deeply care for one another.
Surely, most of us are experiencing the great uncertainty of these times. As we were writing Opening to Grief in a world that now seems distant, we were mostly focused on personal losses, such as the death of a partner, a parent, or a child. Other personal losses, such as getting fired or laid off, or facing failing health. This was our mindset last spring when we'd finished the manuscript. We dotted our I's and submitted it to the publisher. By the middle of March, though, we were suddenly sitting with a huge elephant in the room. It's difficult to remember now because it feels so innocent or naive, but it wasn't so obvious then how many people would die, how long this pandemic might last, or how it would come to seep into almost every detail of our lives. Those of us who were fortunate enough to have a choice to work at home were simply sequestering in place for what looked like a few months. Our minds and our hands were full, just learning to adapt to strange new conditions. And so the most challenging part of writing Opening to Grief was deciding what to say in an author's note that we knew needed to be at the front of the book. I suspect that we were not the only authors facing this dilemma and this task. How to think about and describe the elephant. Grief that isn't only our personal experience, but big grief that holds our collective experiences of loss and heartbreak that we were all just beginning to feel and name.
We brought into the author's note this reflection from David Brooks' writing in the New York Times in early April at the beginning of the pandemic. Brooks had asked his readers to tell him about their experiences and how they were holding up. In a few days, he received over 5,000 replies. He writes, "I think I expected a lot of cheerful coming together stories, but what I got shocked me. It was heartrending and gutting, frankly. People are crying a lot. It tends to be the young who feel hopeless, who feel their plans for the future have suffered this devastating setback, a loss of purpose, a loss of hope. Then the old, especially widows and widowers, talk about the precariousness of it, the loneliness of it. They just feel vulnerable, extremely vulnerable. And while a lot of people are doing pretty well, there's just this river of woe, a river of grief out there that has really shocked and humbled me."
Now as we all know, we're at more than 237,000 dead in the United States and surging, with models predicting twice that many Americans could be dying by early winter. We're living through a pandemic, not only of the virus, but a pandemic of fear, grief, anger, and division. Like people living with a terminal illness, we don't make plans because we don't know what's ahead. Of course, uncertainty and vulnerability have always been with us, but now we're confronting not knowing, not having a clue in ways that are frankly stressing nearly all of us. Aren't we being called to cultivate a new relationship with big uncertainty so that we can better meet whatever arises, including great losses that perhaps we didn't expect and that we do not want? And maybe even to see how grief and love are radically intertwined. We grieve because we love, and in our grief, we continue to love deeply. This is essentially the message or heart of the book.
We've chosen a few chapters to share with you tonight. Opening to Grief also includes, in addition to what we're going to mention, chapters on mindfulness, on finding refuge in writing, on making art, and on cultivating a gratitude practice. Each chapter ends with a simple meditation and suggestions for starting points in your own explorations. Part of what makes Opening to Grief a kind of companion in a time of pain and suffering is poetry. We've chosen some exquisite, accessible poems to lead most of the chapters, and I'd like to start by reading a poem called Naming by Carol Lynn Knight. Naming. If I name this grief, define it without guilt and redemption, call it drowning, desolation, call it fire and stone, then I'm bound to care for it. Like a stray cat I name that demands I feed him. He comes and goes, sometimes disappears for days and then returns, insisting that I remember. There's no one single expression or feeling that we recognize as grief. The container we call grief holds familiar emotions, such as sorrow or despair, but also emotions and feeling states that we may not immediately associate with grieving, such as anxiety, loneliness, fear, anger, or rage. Grief may appear as numbness, or as relief, or even gratitude, or even as stillness. I want to just add something here that I think it's expressing grief as anger is very common in our culture because it leaves us a sense of agency that feeling the sorrow and vulnerability doesn't offer. Grief also manifests with physical symptoms such as disrupted sleep, over or under eating, fatigue, shock, and confusion. And behaviors like drinking too much, partying, overworking, underperforming, not exercising at all, or exercising obsessively. Some find they can't concentrate, focus, or even read. And others, especially in the face of a traumatic death, experience a profound loss of faith. A few years ago, I was leading a bereavement group, and 2 members joined on the same evening. One man, John, had lost his wife just 3 weeks before. She had been sick a long time. John stayed for a month and then left because he felt he had finished grieving. After all, he had been anticipating his wife's death throughout her illness. This is one face or expression of grief. The other new member, Matthew, had lost his wife 2.5 years earlier, but he felt he had been distracting himself from his pain and hadn't really grieved her death at all. And now he felt he was ready, and he decided to set aside a regular time and place each week to feel his feelings, and he stayed in the group for 2 years. I'd like to share an excerpt from the poem by Naomi Shihab Nye called Kindness, which leads into the first chapter called Beginning with Kindness. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is you I have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere like a shadow or a friend. Loss shocks us. For many of us, it hits with an enormity that we can't take in. What's happened just doesn't make sense anymore. Is it any wonder that you haven't cleaned your house or are underperforming at work or isolating from friends? Amidst pain and chaos, it's kindness, isn't it, that feels like a reliable anchor? Perhaps the only reliable anchor. I wonder if you've had this experience. Your close friend is grieving and struggling, and you simply remind her to be kind to herself. This is good medicine for the soul. Could we treat ourselves as we'd be with a close friend or a child we love who was hurting? I'll read a few passages from the opening chapter, beginning with kindness. In the weeks, months, and years after a profound loss, it's especially important to offer yourself great kindness. It's the best gift you can give yourself. And as it turns out, it's the best gift you can give to those you love and who love you. How do you begin? Start wherever you are. not in some idealized place, but exactly where you're standing. Perhaps you're someone who has restless energy, who likes to stay busy, who feels indispensable, running from one obligation to the next, who habitually buttons up emotions. Consider easing your schedule and giving yourself a precious gift of time. 10 minutes to sit and listen to a piece of music, an evening to be alone with your discomfort and grief. Maybe you harbor a harsh inner critic, or perhaps a committee of judges who shame you for crying too much, grieving too long, not grieving enough, or not doing it right. Can you ask those voices to back off? Can you stop calling yourself a failure, a fraud, a rock, or a wimp, and offer yourself some empathy and compassion? Can you embrace your vulnerability, your irritability, your impatience, and even your resistance as deeply human responses to separation and loss? Can you see how being open and tender with yourself allows you to better understand and connect with others, those who hurt, and those who haven't yet experienced pain and hardship? If you look deeply and sit with pain and suffering, can you feel how normal sorrow is, how it is a precious part of being human? Can you see how kindness, which includes being kind to yourself, seeing yourself as part of a larger community of people who all bear their own sorrow, is a path within and through grief to a life you might not yet be able to imagine? Can you acknowledge yourself and say thank you for ways you are taking care of yourself, for surviving the small steps you've taken, for moments of joy?
In her collection of essays called High Tide in Tucson, Barbara Kingsolver writes this beautiful paragraph. In my own worst seasons, I've come back from the colorless world of despair by forcing myself to look hard for a long time at a single glorious thing, a flame of red geranium outside my bedroom window, and then another, my daughter in a yellow dress, and another, the perfect outline of a full dark sphere behind the crescent moon, until I learned to be in love with my life again. Like a stroke victim retraining new parts of the brain to grasp lost skills, I've taught myself joy over and over again. I came across this passage after a devastating cancer experience. I'm a photographer, and during the months of chemo and radiation, miserable on the couch, I'd put down my camera and taking pictures, and wasn't sure I'd photograph again. At the time, and even now, it seemed to me that my body was busy simply trying to survive. Following in what I imagined as Kingsolver's footsteps, I decided to look for and photograph one beautiful thing every day. I believe that this practice, a devotion really, renewed my life force. Someone else with different talents and passions might have painted or played music, danced, or cooked a beautiful meal. In Opening to Grief, we write about the joys of making art, not so much as therapy, but as the deep satisfaction of making things.
We both loved writing the chapter called Restoring in Nature. It just feels universal. And there's a growing body of research that documents the benefits of being in restorative environments and spending time outside. From our book. We live in a paradox. Humans have an instinct to bond and affiliate with other life forms. This is what renowned evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson writes about in Biophilia. And yet, elements of our fast-moving culture undeniably have weakened our connection with the natural world. The immediacy and the intensity of technology distract us. As adults, we tie ourselves to computers and mostly work indoors. Even when we're outside, we're tethered to cell phones and handheld devices. Navigating traffic, making split-second decisions, meeting deadlines, responding to emails, tweets, and texts. All these activities bombard us and hijack our attention. When we experience loss and we are grieving, it's more important than ever to find our way back to the garden, to spend time in the healing power of nature. Researchers Rachel and Stephen Kaplan describe restorative environments as outdoor places that are accessible, quiet, and relatively small, such as your yard or a pocket park in the city. And if there's no safe outdoor space where you live, if you're confined indoors, even in a hospital bed, you can rest in nature just looking out the window to a patch of sky or gazing at a plant indoors. When we spend time in restorative places, it becomes effortless to watch leaves floating down from trees, to notice the reflection of the sky in a puddle, or to hear a bird call. These environments draw us in without asking us to focus on anything special. There's nothing to do. So when we return to more focused tasks like writing a report or problem solving, we feel refreshed, relaxed, and better able to focus. In the pandemic, many of us were instinctively drawn to nature. We want and need to be outside. Some of us were visiting big, wild spaces like national parks, if we were lucky enough. Others were enjoying nature close to home, sitting on their front step or looking out a window. I'd like to read a poem by Wendell Berry called The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake at night in the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free.
We all need other people, never more than when we're overwhelmed by grief. We need one another to stay sane, to feel that we belong, to take a break, to fix a leaking toilet, to watch a movie together, to talk about the unspeakable events that have just happened, to sing, to cry, and to laugh out loud. We need to check in with a friend, a walk, tea, a kindness, the presence of another human being who listens and reminds us that everything changes and that someday we'll feel more ease. This is from a chapter called Joining Together, or you could say, we're all in this together. For many of us, it's family members who show up, some families more than others. It's neighbors, old friends, members of your religious community, your church, mosque, or synagogue. Sometimes it's strangers who come bearing life-affirming gifts.
Yet, when you're the person grieving and perhaps isolating, it's not always easy to reach out. When you're overwhelmed with grief, how do you balance the need and the desire to take time out to be alone and to heal, and then to find ways to connect with other people? Sometimes, from the book, sometimes we take a tentative step to reach out and then discover that friends who were attentive during the first few weeks after a death have returned to their own lives. What can be a lifeline then? Some people seek out a grief friend, a person at church or work, or a neighbor who understands that grief doesn't go away and who is willing to sit and listen as we cry, rage, laugh, and tell and retell our story. Maybe you've joined a support group and heard someone say he talks with his departed partner, and you say to yourself, I do that too. Or you hear someone say she can't bear to give her partner's clothes away because she believes, as author Joan Didion did, that her spouse may come back from the dead and need his shoes. And you laugh and you think, me too. Perhaps week after week, you sit with the same people in your bereavement group, and one day you realize you're part of a beloved community.
Last year, my Cape Cod neighbor Trudy opened a fantastic cafe in Wellfleet. I couldn't believe it. When the pandemic hit last spring, the cafe was closed for the season. But Trudy had a stove and a kitchen, and she knew she could feed people. She quickly helped launch a nonprofit called Common Table. She and another neighbor cook, and other neighbors deliver meals to 50 to 150 people 5 days a week. They offer this kindness to anyone living in the extended neighborhood without asking questions about need or circumstance. If you'd like a meal, a volunteer driver will bring it to you. And these neighbors offer much more than just delicious food. They're a daily connection to people who are ill, recovering from surgery, or just shut in. They've celebrated birthdays and wedding anniversaries with people receiving food. It's a joy.
An example of a community that we love comes from Canada, where people who are grieving walk together. As they gather, they say the name of a loved one and the date that a parent, spouse, sibling, or child passed away. Some cry, and then side by side, they walk. No advice or fixing anything. They just offer one another their full presence. Doesn't it make sense that being part of a beloved community, we not only realize that we're not alone, but that even in our sorrow and our brokenness, we still have something to give, that we can still act generously. When one of my bereavement groups was coming to an end, a widower joined a bereavement group that was just getting started. He felt happier and more grounded, and he believed his experiences could be a beacon of hope to those newly bereaved. How will you take your broken open heart, your vulnerability and tenderness, and allow it to restore your own well-being? At some point when you're ready, and only when you're ready and have enough energy to reach out, how will you allow your grieving heart to connect with others and make the world a little bit more friendly?
We'll briefly touch on the last chapter because we want to leave room for your questions and for sharing. How do you end a book on grief? There's no promise that we or anyone else can make that everything's going to be fine. And if you as a writer try to wrap everything up and tie a bow too tightly, you risk oversimplifying. Perhaps you speak to one person's experience, but you leave others with little meaning. And yet, aren't there some comforting and truthful words you can say? The last chapter is welcoming the life that's yours. It begins with this reflection from Beth, describing a moment about a year after the death of her beloved partner, Chris. It was a surprising sensation after that first searing year Chris was gone. I was staying at a friend's house in Provincetown and biking late at night down a winding hill at the west end of town. Rounding a corner where there's almost no light, there was the familiar exhilaration of speed and warm June air, nothing but wind, sky, and trees around me. Then a thought slipped in, be careful, you want to live. Live? Wanting to live? What a concept. Was this a slight crack in the pane? I let the moment wash over me with the breeze and the moonlight. I was still miserable without her, my girlfriend gone far too soon at age 46 of cancer. But flashes of light were starting to break up the unbearable darkness. We don't get to choose what happens to us. Experiences arise. We don't always get what we like, or you wouldn't be drawn to this book. For most of us, there's no avoiding grief. Sometimes terrible things happen. And yet, perhaps you can imagine a moment when grief lifts just enough so that you sense something changing. You see that some old habits and behaviors no longer sustain you and don't support the well-being of our children and future generations. In this clear awareness, you recognize that now you have a chance to make different, more life-affirming choices, perhaps. You needn't succumb to despair. You catch a glimmer of something fresh. Perhaps it's a feeling akin to hope, more sanguine or buoyant energy than you've known in a long while. Or maybe it's a whiff of persistence, of your own grit and resilience. You can keep going, you can cultivate an unshakable core. Even though you wouldn't have chosen all the life you have, you feel some sense of purpose and you feel more balanced, more at home, stronger, and more accepting of what's happened and the way your life is unfolding. How is this possible? When everything's uncertain, how can there be light? And yet for many people, there is. Some speak of grace or mercy, and others who don't believe in a higher power find solace in the human capacity to suffer and cry, but also to laugh, and even in the most tragic situations, to glimpse joy. What if we got in touch with our vastness, our capacity like a lake or the sky to hold whatever arises? What if we allowed everything that's happened, accepted all the experiences we've had, those that we like, those that we don't choose? What if we were to pause and allow grief to wash over us and change us, as it inevitably does, and let ourselves open and be fully here in the only life that's ours to live? What have you learned from your suffering and pain? What do you have to share? How will you spend your precious life, this moment, these 24 hours?
We close this section of the book with a poem by Alfred Huffstickler called The Cure. We think we get over things. We don't get over things. Or say we get over the measles, but not a broken heart. We need to make that distinction. The things that become part of our experience never become less of our experience. How can I say it? The way to get over a life is to die. Short of that, you move with it. Let the pain be the pain, not in the hope that it will vanish, but in the faith that it will fit in, find its place in the shape of things, and be then not any less pain, but true to form. Because anything natural has an inherent shape and will flow towards it. And a life is as natural as a leaf. And that's what we're looking for. Not the end of a thing, but the shape of it. Wisdom is seeing the shape of your life without obliterating, getting over a single instant of it. Before we invite you into the conversation, I just want to point out what's in the back of the book. The book has 4 sections. We just read from the first section. In the second section are deepening practices, and we infuse opening grief with practices, some of which are from the tradition of mindfulness and meditation. They're simple practices, but they're not easy. And so we've written in more detail about them for those of you who are interested and want some support. And in the third section is questions people ask. And I think at this point what we'd like to do is to open it up and see what questions people have, and also what resources other people have used to carry them through grief. We'd love to hear both of those things.
Hi, Claire, Marnie, thank you both so much. I'm going to hop back on to help read through the Q&A. And everyone in the audience, please feel free to continue dropping questions. So our first question has to do with COVID, and specifically people who have lost loved ones suddenly and without the opportunity to say goodbye and grieve with them. Do you have any suggestions for those people?
It's really hard. I can only share some of the things that I've seen people do that I've worked with. Obviously, people have created gatherings on Zoom, and other people have created small gatherings outside. I think one of the things about losing somebody, the grief that comes from losing someone during COVID, is that it also tends to open up other earlier griefs that we each all have carried that haven't been grieved. Sometimes we can try to integrate these losses through writing. I know people that have written to their loved one after they've died. They frequently talk with people who have died. Different people have made collages. It's really hard not to be able to say goodbye, but I think doing things in writing, unsent letters, can be helpful too.
A second part to that question is the grief of an anticipatory grief that people are experiencing around the loss of companionship and being able to socialize and losing work and regular routines. So not necessarily the loss of a person, but the loss of personal connection. They also mention holiday traditions, and with the holidays coming up, I think it's going to be a very strange year.
There's a lot of anticipatory grief, and I think there was also a lot of anticipatory grief around the election too. No matter how you felt about it, holidays are tricky. I think some people are thinking about trying to do them in the way they've done them before. Other people are thinking about modifying them, and some people are thinking about just not doing them at all. It's very difficult. Anticipatory grief is pretty common right now for all of us in terms of looking ahead and not knowing what we're going to be losing in the forthcoming weeks and months, besides facing the pandemic and the inevitability of this COVID growing. But anticipatory grief is pervasive in the culture right now, and we have to get creative about how we spend Thanksgiving, and I think and holidays, and I think probably a lot of people are going to be doing it on Zoom, just to be safe, to be extra safe.
Right, and that is the burden that we all need, to keep everyone else safe, but sometimes it's painful to do so, right?
Yeah.
Claire, how does a Buddhist approach to loss and grief differ from more Western approaches, such as Kübler-Ross?
Marnie, you may want to help me on this.
Try.
So my practice is Zen, and I'm a member of a Sangha whose focus is end of life. So there's a lot of emphasis on how to be intimate and be with what is as it is, and using meditation to sit and allow what is to be. Marnie, do you want to say something in addition to that? Because I'm not sure. Well, one of the things that, let me just say this, that we use contemplative practices a lot. I use a lot of meditation and meta-meditation for people towards the close of life. That's, I found, very helpful. And also the practice of Tonglen has been very helpful too. But I think that Buddhism confronts death in a way that some of the other Western religions don't do in this as frontally. Marnie, do you want to say something?
I think there's, Buddhist, at least Buddhist inspired, but, way wider than that. But, the notion of a daily practice that can be very simple and as John Kabat-Zinn says, and not easy, but something like sitting, pausing and sitting, or attending to your breath or to your body, or to listening, or to senses. And there is something. It does over time become a kind of a refuge that, or a safe harbor that is really rich terrain. And I think that's why we've, really made that part of the book. But it is the notion of a daily practice that in some way sustains you, that sustains you, and in itself, its essence is being kind to yourself. And so it's, yeah.
I think part of it too might be we live in a death-denying culture. We live in an idealizing of youth culture. And when you sit with no distraction for some period of time or even for days, things come up that you spend a lot of time trying to push away. And so you eventually begin to make peace with mortality, especially if you're a midlife or older person. But the distractions that keep you from thinking about that aren't there because you just have to sit with yourself.
A little bit of a follow-up question. What is a metta meditation?
A metta meditation is a loving kindness meditation, or I read the other day, some people call it a tender friend. And we end every chapter with metta meditation. And they're usually aspirations we have that we express first for ourselves, and then for those we love, and then for those that are more neutral in our life, such as a mailman, a clerk at a store. And then we try to extend them towards people that we have a lot of trouble with. So some of the common meditations, metta meditations that you see in the books are, may I be free of fear, may I be healthy, may I be happy, may I find inner peace. In my groups, when I'm working with people who are living with life-threatening illnesses, I usually say, may I be free of fear? And I ask each person to express that for themselves, and then we extend it to others. May you be free of fear. May I have self-compassion. May I know how deeply I'm loved. May you know how deeply you're loved. May you have strength for your journey. Those are some of the mettas I use, but they're wishes, they're loving wishes, as you would express towards a friend tenderly.
And you also briefly mentioned, excuse my pronunciation, Tonglen. And I wonder if you could differentiate that between metta meditation.
Well, metta meditation is extending these aspirations, starting with yourself and then to people you love, the neutrals, and the people that you don't love as much, or you're learning to love. Tonglen is a taking in and a giving out. It's a practice that there's nothing about Tonglen in the book, I just want to say, because it's a pretty sophisticated practice, but it's a way of breathing in what's difficult or hard and breathing out wishes for healing. So if I see something on the street that's really upsetting to me, often what my feeling is, I just want to turn my head, or I may want to stop breathing. And if I remember, I might think about doing Tonglen, which is just breathing in the suffering that I'm seeing, and then breathing out a wish for that person to be healed, or for that person to be safe, or whatever it is. But we don't mention that in the book, and that's a pretty advanced practice. But metta is something we can all do when we feel helpless. And it's been a useful practice when I sit during COVID, because there's so much suffering in the world. And we can only touch what's in our own world with kindness. And it's a way to try and hold the larger suffering and be with it. And it's a form of prayer, I suppose. You know, it's maybe what the Christians would call prayer.
You know, another thing to say is a lot of people, you know, decide they're going to try to meditate, and they give up. And it's really easy to give up, because there's so many ways that you can think, I'm not doing this right, or I think it's really important to say that it's really helpful to find a teacher. It's really helpful to find a community. It is hard to read a book. I mean, it's a good start, but it is really hard to read a book and begin a practice, and 3 years later still be practicing. It is more subtle than I thought. And I will say that for somebody with my upbringing, which is, you know, Western, big cognition, you know, brainiac family, there's nothing that really orients you to the kind of attending that is the essence of all of these meditative practices. So it's helpful for people to know that doing it alone is, it's difficult.
I just want to share something. There's a wonderful New Yorker cartoon that I saw many years ago where everybody is sitting with their crossed leg and they've got their fingers in this position on their knees and they all look like they're serious meditators. And then there's these bubbles coming out of each person's head. One of them says, I forgot to stop at the market. And the other one says, oh, I've got to get home quickly. My wife's coming home from work late tonight. And then the last one says, I bet everybody in the room can do this but me. And I love that because it's the way you look around the room at a retreat and you think everybody's doing it but you, and meanwhile your mind is busy. So it's a simple practice, but it's very hard.
I've had about, I want to say, 5 false starts of trying to start a practice myself. So I could definitely
The
attest
average
to that.
person can keep their mind on their breath for 2 to 3 breaths, and they're off and running. So,
But those 2 to 3 breaths are good ones.
they're good, but it's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
I have a feeling that metta meditation will apply to our next question here. Grief also is worse when a family member hurts you during a parent or loved one's death. It is like you're losing more than one person at a time. I wonder if you could speak to the entanglement of grief and anger and forgiveness for someone who may still be living.
Can you read the first part of that question again? Because I had trouble understanding it.
Grief can be worse when a family member hurts you during a parent's death. It is like you lose more than one person at a time.
There's a thing in the literature called secondary losses, and often, let me just speak about this generically and then I'll come back to this other piece. When we lose somebody that we love, that's called the primary loss. But often, along with the primary loss, for instance, the loss of a husband, you may lose economic stability, you may lose the breadwinner, you may lose your home, you lose a co-parent, you may lose a co-grandparent, you may lose a future travel companion. There are many losses that are secondary to the primary loss that are not secondary in impact. In fact, sometimes a secondary loss can have a more primary impact than the primary loss. So I just want to say that. And one of the things that can happen in families where people are grieving differently, it's very easy for people to inadvertently hurt one another. And that's one of the secondary losses, is that the family relationships can start to shift. People may go into cutoff, it has many configurations, and there may be triangulation. There's a lot of ways it can take. And hopefully that in the rawness of the grief right afterwards, that what happens often is families go back into their childhood positions and we lose our adult self, and things get said that didn't mean to. And I would just say that the different way people express grief can be very painful in families. And when people say things that are hurtful during that tender time, they can often feel exaggerated in their pain. They hurt more than they would ordinarily. And I guess at some point, forgiveness comes into the picture. And how do we forgive ourselves for what we can't yet forgive? And starting there.
All right, and then our next sharing. I lost my husband and best friend last year when I was 53. He was 55. I think the hardest thing is that no one except other young widows, not my close friends or family, could understand the devastation and suffering that this continues to be daily. I can't share it with them because it's both too painful for me and too much for them to carry with me and still want to be in my company. I think that is the hardest part.
So, I think this is often friendships shift after something like this, that you see people come into your life that you didn't expect, and people disappear that you thought for sure would be there. And I think a lot of this has to do with our own capacity to grieve, because we can't really be with people who are deep in grief if we aren't somehow treating ourselves kindly towards our own grief. And so that's one of the things that happens, is that people can't bear it. I think also we talk about this in the cancer world, but I think it's also true with grief, that there's an invisible line, this invisible barrier, fence between people who are grieving, who've lost someone, and the rest of the world. That it's because you carry on and you look okay, and people don't often know the enormity of the loss you're carrying inside. But other people do know it. And I find in our bereavement groups that people can almost finish each other's sentences sometimes, because there's a knowing that someone who hasn't had that life experience can't know in the same way. And that adds to the loneliness of the grief, that feeling.
I think now that almost half of the country is feeling loss, and I wonder how they can be helped through this time. And I am not sure if that is COVID or election related, but take the path you choose, Claire. And
that's
Marnie.
yours, Marnie. I've had this question or some variation of it in the last couple of weeks, and I think the only thing we can do is do the next kind gesture for somebody in our life. Because when we're grieving, one of the ways we can soften our own grief is to help another person. And that way we alleviate or soften their grief as well as our own. But sometimes the only thing we can do is just, I think, offer kindness where our lives are touching another's life. And all of us have people in our lives who can use a random act of kindness, even if it's writing letters to inmates. That's something I've been doing a lot of. People who feel forgotten. And there's certainly a lot of people in the world that feel that way. I don't think they're far from any of our lives. Marnie, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I mean, it's the question. It is the question of the hour. You know, if you, at least in these days of post-election, half the country is feeling loss, and half the country is celebrating. And it's going to be everybody's task to reach across that chasm, and begin to be able to talk to people whose views are very, very different. I mean, that's going to be Joe Biden's task. It's going to be everybody's healing task.
Yeah, I mean, even in families where people are politically divided, I mean, how do you reach across that? It's tough.
And is that the advice you would have to somebody grieving a friend, that they feel they have to let go over election disappointments and differences?
I hate to think of people losing friends over election differences or political differences, because certainly a good friendship has more substance than a political conversation, I would hope. That's hard to answer without more specifics, I think.
But there are times. I mean, during the Vietnam War, there were friendships severed, because it just, things mattered so much. And this is another, really, really big time.
And I wonder if the two of you could talk about the impetus for writing this book and what you hope it will give to readers.
I'm still thinking about the previous question. Can I just
Of course, yeah, go for it. And we have more politics questions too, if you're
I'm
for
going
it.
to answer it in an apolitical way, because anything we're passionate about, and when we get really passionate about politics, I think the derivation of the word passion is suffering. And what is it what's the conversation underneath the political conversation? If we get so passionate that a relationship is at stake, there's a suffering, and maybe it's a grief that we're not reaching, that we're not dealing with, and that we're not talking about, and it's getting politicized, but that it's something more than that. I'm still thinking about that question, sorry. So what drove me to write the book? Passion, actually. It's been a passionate obsession of mine for the last 4 or 5 years. I think seeing how people have suffered in their grief because of shame and guilt and not finding cultural support, and finding myself saying the same thing over and over, I just thought I need to put this into a book because I don't want people to feel so alone. It's one thing to suffer. It's another thing. There's a myth in Buddhism where they call the second arrow. The first arrow is the pain. It's the loss. It's the death, whatever it is. The second arrow is what you shoot at yourself with judgment and shame and guilt about how you're dealing with the first loss. And I think I wanted to normalize what I see happening, which isn't written about as much as I would like to see it written about and normalized, so that people don't feel there are rigid stages they have to go through, or that their grief should look in a particular way and it should last a particular time. There's as many different faces to grief as there are people grieving, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. There's only your way. And I wanted this book to support that and to give people resources. Each chapter I think of as a resource for holding grief and strengthening our capacity and our resilience to hold our suffering, and therefore be able to hold the suffering of those we love.
And what brought you to this work? No, it's probably a very long story. Just tell us your whole life.
I have family on this in this call.
It was anonymous, so they're keeping.
Yeah, but I see their names, and I wish I could see their faces. In my family, I'm known as the probe, and I'm known for being so intense. And and this work gives me a place to be who I am without being judged with those labels. That's the truth. I love talking about people's grief, and I love talking about death and dying, because to me these things are all connected to life, and my life is happier for being able to do this. To me, it's a source of joy and meaning. So that's that's what I would say to that question. Oh, I'm going to hear about this.
Claire was born for this, for this work. Yeah.
Oh.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Can you speak to unanticipated milestones in a grief journey? Last year, I lost my wife of 32 years following a shocking cancer diagnosis just 6 months before, and only 3 weeks after my 91-year-old father died after a year on hospice. I have been through an anticipated known first, birthdays, anniversaries, etc. The election in the past week has brought up a whole range of emotions which feel like losing them all over again because of being in a world they couldn't imagine and we didn't share.
You know, it's interesting, yeah. Read the first part of the question again. I'm sorry, it was long and I...
Nope, that's okay. Let me just find it. There we go. Could you speak to unanticipated milestones in a grief journey?
Yeah. I don't mean to sound flip when I say this, but I think there are certain milestones that we need to anticipate. And when we don't anticipate them, they catch us off guard. And actually, they can catch us off guard if we do anticipate them. But the first year of all holidays, anniversaries, birthdays. I always say in my groups that we need to plan for these. How are you going to, what is the meaningful way for you to spend them? Do you want to spend some part of the day alone? Which friends can support you? Do you want to go to the gravesite? It's really important to plan for these. And often what I hear is people often find the anticipation of that event is harder than the event itself because they've so prepared for it. And having said that, there's a lot of things we can't prepare for too. So in response, I would say try to anticipate where the difficulty will be, who you want to be with, and how you can make meaning for yourself out of that day. Maybe it's just going to the gravesite and talking to your beloved. Maybe it's writing a letter. Maybe it's planting a tree to remind you. But to do it as mindfully as you can so that you're not broadsided any more than you may necessarily be just by the enormity of the feelings. But anniversaries are very hard, especially the first year. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. It's just 8 o'clock, so right on the nose.
Thank you all for coming. We would love to have you. If you're going to buy the book, could you please buy it locally at the Booksmith and review it on Amazon? We're trying to keep our local bookstore in business.
We do appreciate it.
Yes.
And you can visit us at brooklinebooksmith.com and brooklinebooksmith.com/events to see upcoming events. And for anyone who ordered a book bundled with their tickets, we will be shipping them shortly after today, and you'll receive an email when they're ready for pickup or shipped. But again, Claire, Marnie, thank you both so much. This has been fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for coming.
Good night.
Good night.